Welcome. My name is Lucan. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Toronto and co-director of the Petro Jacyk program for the study of Ukraine. Welcome to today's session on Russian disinformation. Now, in 2014 and 2016 in the United States, Russian disinformation was given enormous amounts of attention because it played an enormous role in the invasion of 2014. As well as in the US presidential election in 2016. And indeed, many began to talk about how the era of sort of old-fashioned war had gone and had been replaced by a new kind of hybrid war in which the focus was less on sort of conquering territory and more on sowing confusion. Obviously, that has turned out not to be the case, as we discovered on February 4th. But it is still striking, at least to those who don't study this stuff, how little a role disinformation has played so far. And the question is, is this in fact the case? And what role is Russian disinformation playing in the conflict? So today, to discuss these very important issues, we have four distinguished guests. The first is Marta Dyczok, who's an associate professor of political science and history at Western University. She's also, works very closely with the Petro Jacyk program. She's written 5 books, most recently Euromaidan, Broadcasting Through the Information Wars. Next, from sunny Stanford University, where I spent much of my youth, and people always wonder, why did I go to University of Toronto where it's so cold? Anyways, she is research scholar at the Stanford Internet Observatory. Her area of focus is on sub-Saharan Africa, and she used to be a professor at the University of Memphis. Then, most importantly, from Ukraine, we have 2 distinguished observers of these issues. Yevhen Fedchenko, who's director of the Kyiv Mohyla School of Journalism, and the chief editor of Stop Fake. He's had 20 years experience in Ukrainian media, has contributed to every known publication virtually, it seems like. We also have Volodymyr Yermolenko, who's a Ukrainian philosopher, who's also an associate professor at the Kyiv Mohyla Academy. He is editor of Ukraine World and has won like a lot of prizes. We have the Shelby Prize for Best Essay Book in 2018, the Petro Mohyla Prize in 2021, and the Book of the Year Prize. So it's really wonderful to be here with these distinguished observers. So I'm going to start with our guests from Ukraine, maybe with you, Yevhen. Can you just sort of talk about what kinds of disinformation strategies you've seen from the Russian side during the most recent war, after, before and after the invasion?
Yeah, thank you so much, first of all, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to participate. And as a representative of Stop Fake, I might say that we've been following Russian disinformation since 2014. And we've been monitoring it, researching it. And basically, because of that, we were capable to predict when the incursion would start. And we mapped the main narratives with which Russia would enter this incursion. So for us, it was kind of nothing of a surprise here. And again, just because we followed it on a regular basis, and also Stop Fake is debunking Russian disinformation. That's why we not only know how this disinformation is constructed actually, but we also been deconstructing it to make sure that it would have little impact or no impact at all. So if you would ask me to single out one achievement of Russian disinformation, if any, I would probably answer that Putin successfully created parallel reality, which became a basis for Russian decision-making. And as Financial Times writes on April 24th, Putin sincerely believes in the nonsense he hears on Russian disinformation. And Russian president appears to hold a distorted view of the war as set out by his generals and depicted on Russian television summarizes FT, and that's exactly was our impression as well, that he created this parallel reality and he lives in this reality, and he also makes Russians living in the same bubble as he is. And then all Russian disinformation can be divided into different subcategories, targeting different audiences. Of course, with a very different level of success, from very modest, if we talk about Ukrainian audiences, to kind of a little bit more advanced, and I would say a little bit more about this. So, for example, for Russian domestic audience, disinformation explains how Russia is, of course, winning this war. Not only against Ukraine, because that's not a serious enemy, but against whole NATO and the West, successfully overcoming sanctions and unilaterally dominating the world system. So the West, of course, is surrendering under the impact of Russian super weapons, economic system are collapsing around the West. And if to borrow a line from Soviet playbook, and a lot of things we now see in Russian disinformation is actually borrowed from old Soviet disinformation textbook. So we can say that Western proletariat is not looking forward to their bleak and unhappy future. So that's exactly the line Soviet television was using for many, many years, and now it's back to Russian television. So most Russians so far are happy to live in this comfortable bubble because it explains how they win. So if Russian disinformation targets Ukrainians, of course, it explains things very, very differently. For example, that Ukraine already lost this war. Armed forces are not existing or very close to that. Russia is using very high precision missiles against military infrastructure only, and that's why there is no civilian casualties among Ukrainians. Also, there is no salaries and no pensions for Ukrainians, and that's where we come to this very famous narrative which Russia was pushing for 8 years, that Ukraine actually is a failed state, and so they come again to this and just try to prove it. And of course, Ukrainians do not believe it due to, first of all, very high level of resilience, because again, if we would compare it to 2014, then the level of resilience was non-existent at all, and there was a huge vacuum of information, and that's why Russians were quite successful back then, and that's why they're not successful now, because we've already seen all this, we've already been to all these narratives, and also because Ukrainians already have a just common sense and can see all those things with their own eyes, and that's why they're not, there is no much success with that. I want to stop separately with international audience, where Putin is a little bit more successful, especially at Global South, but we would have kind of a separate speaker about that. Even now, after 8 years of the war, actually, a lot of people are still believing what Russian disinformation is saying. Even after these 2 months of very intensive warfare, we still see that the people disinformation have ears of people. For example, international audience gets very distorted image of Ukraine as a democratic, reliable partner of the West, which shares democratic values, and that's very important. For example, if you would try to look into numerous articles which appeared in different media outlets, including in Western media outlets, not only Russian disinformation, but also many Western journalists were writing that if you would provide, for example, Ukraine with weapons, it would immediately get to far-right and neo-Nazis from Azov regiment, for example. So you should think twice before giving any weapon to Ukraine. And that was quite successful during quite a long period of time. But now, of course, it's a little bit kind of on the margins, and less journalists are buying this narrative from Russian disinformation. But Russian disinformation is actually still sticking to this. Also, they say if you would provide Ukraine with weapons, you should not be surprised if you would see it to be sold somewhere on the black market of the Middle East or African countries, because Ukraine is notorious for its corruption, and Ukrainian armed forces is not exception here. Another important narrative is about Ukrainian refugees, and this is potentially a very harmful narrative, because it explains that Ukrainians are looking for any opportunity. Actually, Ukrainians are very militant and barbaric nationalists, looking for any opportunity to pick a fight with local people in countries which are kind of accepting Ukrainians. We've seen those stories coming from Poland, Germany, the Netherlands, and recently Italy. The purpose of this disinformation is actually to smear the image of Ukrainians, create clashes with locals, and discourage them from welcoming more Ukrainians. Another important category is about weapons of mass destruction, especially biological weapon. And we've seen a lot of stories about allegedly Pentagon-run biolabs, which was developing weapons of mass destruction. And those type of stories are still pushed very heavily. We just see the other countries joining the ranks of the operators. For example, Poland and Germany was recently added to that. Then a lot of stories which smears Ukrainian armed forces, portraying them as looters and kidnappers. For example, recently Stop Fake debunked a story about foreign sailors allegedly kidnapped from their ships. The only problem is either they were not kidnapped, as it was a story about Bulgarian boat, or it was actually done by Russians. So here it's an example when they're just mirroring what they are actually doing and try to demonstrate that it's actually done by Ukrainians. And last, but probably the most important category of disinformation narrative used by Russia is a genocide denial. So, for example, they insist Bucha massacre never happened in reality, and motives never were to target Ukrainians just because they are Ukrainian. And they say it was all staged by the West with only objective to frame Russia and actually punish it for its kind of independent standing on the international arena. And as I said, after 2 months of the war, it's a little bit more difficult for Russia to push these narratives around. But again, as I said, there are still audiences for them. And that's why we need to continue fighting them. But for example, we made some, just to finish, some adjustments in what audiences we are targeting at Stop Fake. So we actually gave up on Russian audiences because, as I said, they're inoculated in their bubble, and it's almost impossible to penetrate it for different reasons, from technical reasons to political and ideological reasons. So now we're targeting more and more people living in the global south, and we reintroduce our Spanish language service and French language services to target Francophone African countries and Latin American countries, but also we work very actively with audiences around Europe. So we work in Italian and German now. So that's how we kind of shift the focus of our counter disinformation activity. So probably I would stop here, but I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks. So I mean, my understanding from what you're saying is that basically, it hasn't worked out all that well, Russian disinformation. And I mean, certainly in Russia, I think, you're right, but I guess that's a little bit less surprising given his control over media, but certainly in Ukraine, it hasn't been successful. And, what you said about refugees and the dangers of arming Ukraine, I mean, thankfully, the West has, given rather significant arms to Ukraine, so that, can't have worked that well. So I want to turn it to you, Volodymyr. I mean, do you share Yevhen's assessment? And also maybe if you could talk a little bit about specifically the southeast of Ukraine, if you're able to, because I think that's, I guess, the area where, of course, historically, people would have expected Russian disinformation to have a little bit more of a sort of soil and stuff. And I mean, at least when I see pictures of Kherson and people carrying Ukrainian flags, I mean, at least to the outsider, it doesn't feel like it's worked that well. Maybe that's not surprising. I don't know, but what are your thoughts, Volodymyr?
Thank you. It's very good, very honorable to be in this with this public. Well, you ask whether I agree with Yevhen. We know Yevhen for such a long time, so sometimes when he speaks, I think that probably He's just reading in my mind. I don't know whether it works vice versa. But of course, I share lots of estimations of Yevhen. Let me start a bit from philosophically, from two philosophical thoughts, as I am a philosopher and much more than a media expert as Yevhen. First, I think we should be very critical to the very word disinformation, because the key goal of Russian information warfare is not even to disinform or to spread lies, but I think the key aim is to dehumanize. And if you ask a question whether it was successful, of course it was successful in Russia, because it reached its goal to dehumanize Ukrainians, Europeans, Americans, and many other people. And otherwise we wouldn't have a situation when Russians approved this bloody and cruel war, and even approved the Bucha massacre. So, of course, there is some kind of denial, but you can also see in Russian publics spreading the message, for example, that Bucha massacre we can repeat, the famous slogan of Russian propaganda. Unfortunately, this dehumanizing thing is very important, and therefore we should pay so much attention to it. And therefore, when thinking about sanctions, thinking about prosecution, thinking about war crimes, we should also target these people, because they prepare the ground. Why Russia is able to do war crimes, and its soldiers are able to do war crimes and genocide in Ukraine? Because their propagandists have been telling them for years that Ukrainians are doing genocide on territories they have no access to. And this was one of the Putin's narratives. So I think the key goal of any propaganda is twofold. First, is to deny that your opponent really exists as a subject, as an agent, and therefore we have this narrative of Ukraine failed state. Therefore we have this narrative of Ukraine as invented country. But we have the same about America, by the way, about Canada in Russian propaganda, about Europe. Lots of narratives that Europe will go into collapse, that Canada is not a true country, that United States are going to collapse. This is how Russian propaganda was presenting, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement as well, or for example, the Capitolium events, as you know, the America is going to collapse. But the next narrative is that, well, even if your opponent does exist, it doesn't have a moral right to exist. And therefore you have all this story about fascists, Nazis in Ukraine, etc. I think this is a very important point to remember, that it's not only about telling lies. Because, for example, you can say that, I don't know, dogs are cats. And, well, you're saying lie, but it's not leading you to anywhere. If you say that dogs are bloody, you know, killers, it's another kind of lie, you know, dehumanizing, if I can apply it to dogs, of course, you know, dehumanizing narrative. That's very important. Second philosophical observation is that there are numerous intellectuals, including myself, who synchronically try to describe Russia as a kind of a postmodern fascism. And it's very important that it's a combination of this postmodernism and fascism, traditional fascism or Stalinism, with a big hierarchy, you know, of state, etc., but with postmodern element, meaning that there is a belief that you can build a virtual world which will win the reality. And it's a very important belief. And I fully agree with Yevhen that basically this belief strikes back to Russia, because Russia became a victim of its own disinformation, because it's very was prepared to war very bad. But we should also dig into the intellectual and cultural origins of this postmodern fascism. And I think we should look at the 90s, where there were two currents of information and intellectual, you know, climate in Russia. The first current was Western postmodernism of the 60s and 70s, which was kind of putting a question on the, you know, the idea of truth. And the second current is Russian intellectual thought, Russian religious philosophy of the early 20th century. Sometimes it was really sympathetical to fascism of the time. But the important thing is that it denied the importance of facts. It denied the importance of, for example, positivist science. And it was proclaiming the idea, and it was a very beautiful article at the time of Nikolai Berdyaev, Russian philosopher, who was born in Kiev, about Istina and Pravda. So Istina of science was denigrated by this philosophy for the sake of a kind of a spiritual Pravda, meaning that your personal conviction that you are right. And unfortunately, this idea of Pravda re-emerged in the years 2000 with the famous movie Brat 2, and with then Putin repeating the words of this movie after annexing Crimea, that the force is in Pravda, meaning that your personal conviction of your own rightness, no matter what facts are saying, etc. I think we should remember this. My third point, and then I will come to Southeast, to your question, very briefly, Lucan. My third point is that it is very important what is going on in Russian propaganda. Now we see kind of a very specific narrative going on. Yevhen already mentioned this mirroring. The mirroring is one of the most important thing about Russia. For example, why they're starting the war against Ukraine? Because Ukraine was doing the genocide, they say, and it is a mirror of Serbs doing the genocide against in Srebrenica and NATO bombing, Yugoslavia. So they kind of, it's a very specific Russian set of mind that they do not invent anything else. They try to copy the West. They try to show that they can do the same as the West, and copying these arguments. What is now going? There are two arguments which are copied not even from the West but from Ukraine, and it's very paradoxical that Russians are using. The first argument is that the war which is going on is a genocide of Russians. Of course, invented by Americans who drag Russia into the war with Ukraine. Ukrainians and Russians are the same nation, and therefore Americans started this war. I don't know how, but this is how they think, to annihilate Russians, meaning both Ukrainians and Russians. So obviously this is a mirror of the Ukrainian narrative that Ukrainian relations with Russia is a genocide of Ukrainians in many decades and centuries. And the second narrative is that Russia is now waging a war for independence from the West. Of course, this is a mirroring Ukrainian narrative that Ukraine is waging a war of independence against Russia. So interestingly, when we will talk about Global South, it's very important how Russia, which is an empire, is using anti-imperialistic discourse to justify its imperialistic actions. And we should be very clear about that. Now you're asking about Southeast. The key narratives of the South, targeting the Southeast in the recent years were precisely this colonial narrative. So Russians were trying to present the West as an imperialist colonizer who is trying to grab Ukrainians of their land, to force them to sell their land for free, to make Ukrainians, a cheap labor, etc. And to some extent, it worked for Ukrainian citizens, because Ukrainian citizens are very mistrustful to anybody, including to Ukrainian government and including to the West. So the approval of this narrative, and we studied that if you want to look at our research a few years ago on conspiratorial propaganda, you will see that to some segments of the Ukrainian society, including primarily to the Southeast, up to half of Ukrainian population would say they would agree with the conspiratorial propaganda, with conspiratorial narratives, and that the West is, kind of an imperial power and Ukrainians are colonized. The only difference is that when you ask even those Ukrainians who is the worst colonizer, the West or Russia, the answer would be, of course, Russia. So interestingly, Russia pushed the narratives which found agreement with a significant part of the Ukrainian population without this part of Ukrainian population agreeing that they will sympathize with Russia. I think this is what you see finally in Kherson, in some other Russian-speaking regions, that these people could be probably skeptic about Ukraine, skeptic about the West, but it didn't kind of prevent them for openly and bravely go against Russians with Ukrainian flags, as the patriots of Ukrainians, even though they can be very skeptical about Kiev, about central authorities, etc., etc. So I will finish on that and will be glad to answer your questions.
Great, thank you, Yevhen. So I'm going to turn it to you, Marta. I guess I had basically two questions. First of all, more broadly, do you agree with the sort of? It sounds like the kind of message I'm getting from both Yevhen and Volodymyr is that basically Russia didn't even try seriously sort of disinformation within Ukraine. Maybe it felt like it was kind of pointless, given the fact that they see kind of facts on the ground. I guess the question is that your assessment as well? And then sort of speaking more to your sort of expertise, which is in media, maybe if you can just talk about sort of the kind of reaction of the more traditional media. You had a great article in Journal of Democracy, which talked about how Ukrainian television stations have united into one television station. But I'm also just curious about, given sort of Zelensky's, use of social media, and does traditional media even matter in a context in which Zelensky has obviously made very effective use of direct communication?
Thanks, Lucan.
Yeah,
no, those are excellent questions. I'd like to start by thanking both you and Ksenia Kipushinsky, the co-directors of the Petro program on the study of contemporary Ukraine at CERES at the Monk School. You guys have organized this tremendous series of seminars, which at least 2 a week. So thank you, that's great. And also Volodymyr Yermolenko and Ola Kisarchuk, who are making all of this happen behind the scenes. I'm also delighted that we have 2 of our colleagues from Ukraine joining us. I think it's very important that when we speak about Ukraine, that Ukrainian scholars are part of that conversation. So thank you very much for your insight. And also a new scholar for me, Shelly, will be speaking after me. The title of this panel is Russian Disinformation Working? That was actually, I came up with that because that is the question that I keep thinking about. And this panel is actually happening a little too early for me because I have started 2 projects to try to unpack that question, and they're not completed yet. So I'm going to tell you about these projects, and then maybe later we can have another one of these. I'm looking at how Canadian media narratives have changed over the past few months, because the disinformation coming out of Russia that both Yevhen and Volodymyr have talked about, I'm interested in is what's happening on this end. And so I've got 2 wonderful research assistants. I think they're in the audience. If we were live, I would ask them to stand up. So Melly and Yevhen are helping me with the data collection. And what Melly's helping me with is looking at Canadian media and how those narratives have changed from January until April. So the types of narratives that Yevhen was talking about were appearing in Canadian media, and that has changed. But the data collection hasn't been completed, so I can't tell you what the results are. So impressionistically, those narratives are receding. And the other project I'm working on, and here Yevhen is my brilliant assistant, so thank you, Yevhen, looking at Zelensky's speeches. Because Lucan, what you asked about is what the impact is, and that's exactly what I'm trying to look at. Because he has been giving speeches both to Ukrainian society and the international community. So the second project I'm going to have results on soon is the first 50 days of war. So we've collected all the speeches and we have now started analyzing them. And I just want to share something that Yevhen prepared for me. So I'm going to try to share the screen here. This is a word. Wow, can you guys see that? This is an analysis of Zelensky's speeches. And we're looking at what he's saying, which words he's using, what tone he's using, and all of that. So this is just a little bit of a preview of what you're going to be seeing soon. But what we're seeing so far is that Zelensky has shifted the tide in the disinformation campaign. So whereas previously the Russian narratives were making their way both into Ukrainian media and international media, what Zelensky did is not so much challenge the Russian disinformation. He is constructing his own narrative. He is constructing the Ukrainian narrative and putting it out there. So instead of saying, no, what you're saying is untrue, he's saying, listen to what I'm saying. And he's using social media and all forms of media very effectively. And what I haven't been able to measure is how people are actually watching his speeches. Because we're seeing them broadcast live, we're seeing them on YouTube, we're seeing them on television, we're seeing them through a wide range of media outlets, and he's doing this very deliberately. And so his communication skills are, I believe, shifting the tide. The question that I won't be able to answer with these studies, which I have to figure out how to answer that, is what impact that is having on international audiences. Because something that Volodymyr was just talking about, the way people receive media messages is very much determined by our pre-existing value systems. And this is something media scholars write about all the time, starting from Stuart Hall to others, that listening to whether it's Putin or Zelensky, the way you will interpret those messages depends on what you already believe. And so that is the hard part of trying to measure the impact of whether it's the disinformation campaign or Zelensky's information campaign, what that impact is. I need to figure out how to try to quantify that. And I'm very interested to hear what Shelly has to say, because we tend to focus on the liberal democracies of the so-called Western world, where it seems to me that public opinion has really shifted to Ukraine's narrative. But what's happening in the rest of the world, I think, is equally important. So I think I'm going to pause there and turn the floor over to Shelly. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. So indeed, we'll go there. So Shelby, I think I'm really happy you were able to join us, because I think it seems to me that, part of the issue here is that within Ukraine, it's kind of a little bit hard to imagine, kind of given the facts on the ground, as well as sort of, Zelensky's skill kind of in communications, which is undeniable, that any kind of disinformation really working that well. But the situation is obviously very different in the global South, because, I have in-laws in Pakistan who, most of whom are overwhelmingly anti-American, and you imagine this sort of anti-imperialist discourse working quite well. At the same time, when I talk to sort of democracy activists from Myanmar, I just gave a talk to them on Monday, they very much saw, Ukraine as sort of symbolic of their own struggle. So we have sort of two competing narratives. One is sort of my Pakistani in-laws, hello if you're watching, who, end up oftentimes kind of repeating some Putin talking points. I have no idea where they got them, that the West is trying to break the back of Russia, that it's all about NATO. And then this sort of competing discourse, which is about sort of, Ukraine's role as sort of combating authoritarianism. So can you just speak to some of those issues, Shelby? Thanks.
Yeah, so I think when we talk about like how Russian narratives are like playing out in the global South, we have to like separate two different types of like information operations. So there's like covert information operations. So like, a Russian government linked actor creating lots of fake Facebook accounts trying to push some sort of message. And then there are overt narratives. So like Russian state media. So I'll take each in turn, and then I'll very briefly talk about kind of how these narratives are are resonating outside the West. So in terms of like overt state media, the platforms, of course, have done a lot of interesting things to reduce the reach and discoverability of Russian state media. So even before the invasion, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube were labeling some state media, though not all state media. And since the invasion, they have taken further actions to downrank Russian state media, block access to Russian state media in some regions. And so it can be a little opaque to figure out where they are applying these restrictions, but almost certainly some of these restrictions are being applied in the global South. When it comes to covert influence operations, there has actually, as far as I know, been no evidence of a Russian government-linked disinformation campaign targeting the global South. There was unfortunately, a Twitter thread by a Western disinformation researcher that went viral a few weeks ago, where he claimed to have found a Russian influence operation targeting people in Africa. Myself and a number of other people looked into that, and we found no evidence to support that claim, and he's since kind of backtracked. But the thread went viral. It was reported on by a lot of like Western media. And I think, one of the things that's kind of unfortunate is that, there's a huge temptation to try to say that you've found like a Russian disinformation campaign because the media is so hungry for it, and you'll get like lots of attention and Twitter followers, and I think to preserve the reputation of this community, the community really needs to be careful and not kind of overstating their claims and doing some in-group policing. But just in general, I mean, of course, there could be Russian disinformation campaigns targeting like people in Africa, and we just don't know about it. So how does this typically play out? Well, typically we're seeing like what I refer to as outsourcing. So this is not just in the global South, but pro-Russian government actors outsourcing disinformation campaigns to digital marketing firms. And so this has all sorts of benefits. You're going to just be able to create better content that will resonate with the people you're targeting if people in that country or in that region are creating the content, as opposed to like some random Arabic speaker in Russia who is Russian. And it also just saves money. So over and over again, we see not just Russia, all sorts of disinformation actors outsourcing their disinformation campaigns to digital marketing firms. We've also seen pro-Russian government actors, instead of trying to create their own new like fake media outlets, they're purchasing existing authentic media outlets. So we saw this happen in Libya, where a Prigozhin-linked group purchased 50% of Al Jamahiriya, which is a like long-standing Libyan media outlet. They did this secretly. They didn't reveal it. And subsequently, the content of this media outlet changed. So it's a really kind of clever, cynical tactic. Why try to grow your own media outlet from scratch when you can just try to influence an existing one? And then last, we're seeing them kind of hack existing accounts. So we saw this happen recently in Ukraine, where pro-Kremlin actors hacked Facebook accounts of Ukrainians and then posted videos claiming Ukrainian soldiers were laying down their weapons, which is not true. And again, this is a really useful tactic, because if you create your own fake account, it just takes a while to like grow an audience and like build engagement. So why not just hack an existing account that already has organic reach? Yeah. Okay. And so last, what are kind of the attitudes of people in the global South toward Russia? Obviously, there's like huge variation. It's also just really hard to know. There aren't a lot of good public opinion polls in Africa. If you want to do a really good public opinion poll, you need to translate that poll into, 20 different languages for just one country. You need to have enumerators who are, trekking like, miles off a, paved road. And while some public opinion polls do this, the good ones don't ask about attitudes toward Russia. So we just really don't know. That being said, the polling that we do have, which is really imperfect, suggests that there's huge variation across African countries with, for example, people in Mali and Cote d'Ivoire fairly likely to support the invasion, and people in, for example, like South Africa, less likely to support the invasion. But I think, we need better data on that to really know for sure.
Thank you. I mean, that's really fascinating. So, so you're basically, I'm sure I shared that post. I'm guilty that you refer to. It was like very visually striking post that Shelby's referring to, of showing sort of disinformation going to the global South rather than. So I'm guilty of that. But that's fascinating. So I guess the follow-up question is, if you have any kind of insight into why you think they haven't made a sort of serious effort at disinformation. Do they just figure the attitude of the global South don't matter, or I mean, you obviously made reference to the fact that they've done it in the past in Libya, and I mean this would, this is a major policy initiative by Putin, to put it mildly. You think they would. I mean, do you have any thoughts on why? Why you think it might? Why no effort?
Yeah, I mean, it's totally possible they are doing this and we just haven't found it yet. But
yeah.
I mean, the big platforms are actively have lots of people looking for this stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, so one possibility is that if they were kind of too overt in their messaging, that it might reduce kind of faith in some of these media outlets. So they really invest in some of these like big Facebook pages for the long term. Like they want them to be like long-term media outlets where 90% of the posts are kind of unobjectionable. And then every once in a while, they'll put in a post that kind of subtly pushes their narrative. The more recent like Prigozhin linked stuff in Africa is very careful and sophisticated and subtle. And they might think that if they went too hard on the Ukraine thing, that it would reduce faith in their outlets. But also, I really think it could be happening and we just haven't found it yet.
Okay. That's great. So I'm interested, a couple of questions, now sort of taking it back to the other participants. I guess the first question for you, Yevhen, you started off by, talking about how, disinformation sort of has really worked in the Russian environment, which at some level is not surprising, given the fact that Putin, controls the media. But on another level, I mean, I guess when this conflict started, I was sort of a bit more optimistic about Russia for a couple of reasons. One, Russia, as bad as Putin was before the invasion, it's obviously changed now. Russia was a far more open society than, say, China or other sort of authoritarian regimes. I mean, internet and stuff, and also, to state the obvious, the difference between conflict in Syria or Chechnya is that a lot of Russians know Ukrainians, have visited there quite often, and so you think they would have ways of getting around the media blockade that they wouldn't have in other conflicts. So why haven't the Ukrainian aunts and grandmas had more of an impact on Russia?
Yeah, actually, this is a great question, and just to be frank, at the very beginning of the incursion, we also were believing that Russia is a little bit more open society, and we were trying to reach out and to explain what is happening, because we did believe that probably Russians are not kind of responsive to all this politically, just because they do not have probably enough information, and this is the key to the problem. So if we would provide them with more information, then they would definitely say, of course, you are right, and we need to support you and to protest against Putin. But it never happened for different reasons, and now we actually had more time to reflect on that, because again, we've been thinking about this war as kind of an 8 years war, but in reality, this war was happening, it was a cultural war, it was ideological war, and it was happening for dozens or hundreds of years, and it accumulated a huge heritage and imperial heritage, including which Volodya was describing. And of course, Russians were believing what propaganda was saying, not because this propaganda was too persuasive, but because this propaganda reflected what they wanted to believe. It reflected the already pre-existing values and beliefs in Russian society, and that's why propaganda was only kind of cementing all those pre-existing things, and that was the key to success of that. And also, when we are talking about how open Russia is, and we've been thinking about the physical kind of penetration of Russian space, and we've been saying, oh, Russia does not have free media, so we need to bring more media from outside of Russia to kind of fill this vacuum. And that was, again, it was wrong approach, as well as it was wrong approach. Let's not kind of counterbalance disinformation, but let's create a lot of interesting and truthful content, and then smart audiences would figure it out by themselves. It was also a wrong approach, because I remember my kind of Soviet childhood, and we also been living in very close society. And when I was switching between two existing TV channels, we had the same pictures over there, but we were looking for alternatives, and we were listening for BBC, for the Voice of America, and it was absolutely illegal, but we were looking for that opportunity. It was a fresh air for all of us. And now we have the opposite situation in Russia. So they had plenty of outlets around them, media outlets, and you can just, open the new window on your computer, and you can potentially access any information you want. But they didn't want to do that. And even when a lot of my friends were trying to call their relatives and friends in Russia at the very first days of incursion, they were not responsive to that, because they said, you are lying. Nothing is happening like that, because it's impossible, because we know that from many sources. And what some people were just doing, they were just sending them the links to stop fake stories, debunking some fakes they've been using as kind of explanatory scenes in this short, laconic conversations they had. And it became obvious that it's impossible to conduct this conversation, because actually there is no real communication channel which works both ways, and so it's not open society, it's not communicative society.
Maybe I could just challenge you a little bit on that. I mean,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
I understand what you're saying, and I certainly I've had my fallouts with Russian friends who, support the war. So I'm certainly not denying that there's, genuine support for the war. On the other hand, the cost of any open opposition is quite high. I'm not sure, I don't know about you, but if I had the prospect of 15 years in jail for criticizing, Trudeau, let's say, in Canada, I probably would just shut up and not say anything. And I just wonder how we can really know, given the fact that Russia, has, in the last month has really, the costs of open expression of dissent have increased dramatically. And also, as you'll recall, at the beginning of the conflict, there was actually a wave of anti-war protest, right? And so I just, it's important not to kind of, I guess, if I may make a comment, feed into kind of stereotypes about Russians as kind of inherently authoritarian. So I just
yeah, that's an important point. I would agree with you, but on the other hand, we had many years before this incursion, and there was no any actual punishment for Russians to demonstrate their potential protest potential, but they never use this, because, as I said, this war is not a new thing, and they had 8 years before to demonstrate, to use any other non-violent means, or probably even violent means to stop this war, and they never use this opportunity. On the other hand, again, I can quote here the Soviet experience. We had, for example, Joseph Zissels, who was a dissident in Soviet times, and he protested. Even if he knew that he would go to jail, but he said, yes, that's normal. If you have ideas and ideals, you should be ready to go to jail to defend that. That's okay, that's normal. And we also had a good friend of mine, the well-known Ukrainian writer, Volodymyr Yermolenko, who actually was using the old Soviet typer to listen to the Voice of America and to make copies and disseminated at his high school. He was at 10 grades, and he was actually arrested, and he would put in a psychological ward for some period of time, but he knew that he needed to sacrifice, because for him, the concept of truth was much more valued than his own freedom. He sacrificed by the end of the day. So it's all, kind of relative, and we have different experiences to compare, and that's why there's a kind of position of those Russians who are saying that they're not ready to sacrifice 15 years to stop the war in Ukraine. Well, I know some people who would be ready to sacrifice those things. That's
Well,
why this argument doesn't work for me.
But Alexei Navalny, of course, who I'm sure you've heard of, obviously is sacrificing, and you don't, right?
If I could jump
Marta,
in here.
please jump in.
Yeah, if I could jump in here, I think this is an interesting conversation, and it leads to the question of media effects and mental maps, right? Because we're talking about why people in Russia believe this and behave that way, but that could be more universally put, whether it's Canada or the US or the global South or any country. That we're talking about media narratives and disinformation and the attempt to manipulate public opinion. But the ability of political actors to actually change people's minds, I think is quite minimal, because people who believe that Trump is a good president, no matter how much information they get about what he's actually done. I mean, that's the media paradox, right? Like, journalists are supposed to put out information to expose wrongdoing, and yet you still will have certain people who don't believe that. But what I find interesting, and again, I don't know if you guys have noticed this, is I see that there's a shift happening as a result of this war, because the war's been going on for 8 years. So this isn't really new, but the last 2.5 months, that is new. And I'm very curious to see if those mental maps are going to be starting to shift, because the discussions among journalists and within academia are quite intense. Now, Lucan, I see there's a few questions in the Q&A. I don't know if we want to address some of them. Some of them are purely factual. So there's somebody who's asking whether media outlets in Ukraine have been shut down by Zelensky. No, that's not true. There have been a few that have their licenses revoked, but those were not independent media outlets. Could you
expand on that actually a little bit?
Say again?
Could you expand? Because I mean, in the New York Times, it was reported that which you've obviously written about, which is the single television station, that Channel 5 was excluded from that. But so what
a few of them, yeah. Okay, very briefly, for those of you who weren't following on this, when the war broke out, most of the major TV channels pulled together and created a 24-hour news cycle. Not everybody was included in that. The smaller ones like Espresso, Channel 5, Priame, they weren't part of that, and they've been complaining about that. And also the channels owned by the pro-Russian politicians, they've had their licenses revoked. I think perhaps Yevhen can add to that.
Okay. So I wanted to thanks Marta for that. That's useful. I actually wanted to sort of put the conversation a bit somewhere else, which is I'm actually surprised because I feel like this hasn't come up, because I feel like actually perhaps the biggest success in disinformation by Putin, in the West, and certainly among my lefty friends, is around NATO, right? He framed this as a conflict about NATO, which factually just makes no sense whatsoever, right? I mean, here you have, first of all, Putin had already basically, taken NATO off the table by invading, Crimea and the like, and the thought that you would, attack NATO by invading a non-NATO country, I mean, it just doesn't make any sort of basic sense. Yet that has become, a deep part of the discourse. I mean, unfortunately, here in Toronto, we have the monk debates, which, by the way, have nothing to do with monk school, but in which this Mearsheimer, who basically has been taking, Mearsheimer at University of Chicago has basically been taking advantage of his tenure to sort of spout ideas that make those. So I'm just wondering if, I'm not sure this relates to any of your specific expertise, but if one of you can comment on the sort of NATO narrative and whether, maybe you, Volodymyr, I mean, do you have any thoughts on this? I mean, how do we sort of combat that narrative? Because I feel like it's obviously a narrative that works very much in sort of Russia's advantage. I mean, if I were Putin, I would sort of promote this narrative because even though he's invaded the country, it kind of makes Putin the victim, which is pretty hard to fathom. But anybody, do you want to speak to that, Volodymyr, or anybody else want to come in on that?
I can quickly, and then Volodymyr. This is the mental maps. People who are anti-American, who believe in American imperialism and NATO and all of that is a threat, they will believe this narrative, whether it's accurate or not. That's what they believe. And so that just feeds into it. Volodymyr, I don't know what you would have to say.
Yeah, absolutely. But let us just make a little bit of, I don't know, argumentation of fact checking. So NATO was expanding, but expanding with the will of countries which were willing to join. Russia is expanding, but against the will of countries which are willing to join Russia. We can quote, I think the key year was actually 2007, when it was a year when Romania and Bulgaria joined the EU. And I think at that point, EU and partially maybe NATO were showing signs of being tired of expansion, enlargement. But then there was a Munich speech of Putin, and then invasion of Georgia in 2008, and signs that Russia is tired of not expanding. So this was the year, very important year, which was showing that Russia is going to expand no matter what, no matter is NATO or not NATO, etc. So just imagine, I always try to kind of, let's imagine a situation when NATO does not expand. Although Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Baltic countries would ask desperately, to join NATO because they were fearing for their security. We would have a situation of a huge, let's say, buffer zone in the Central Europe. And the last time we had this buffer zone was the end of the Habsburg Empire in 1918. And it was basically predicted by many smart observers that this collection of smaller nation states, very brave, very independent, will not last long, because there are two empires, at least the new German Empire and the Russian Empire, which would clash. I think if we had a situation when NATO does not expand, Russia would sooner or earlier come back to its idea that we need to regain this empire. Today's ultimatum before the war, if you read it carefully, would sound very simply: we need to undo the security of Europe because it is based only upon America. We need to base it upon two pillars. One of it is Russia. That means that basically restoring the Warsaw Pact. And if NATO expand, if it doesn't expand, it really doesn't matter, because at a certain point, Russians have started to feel that they need to reconquer the previous territories that they think they lost. And that comes until Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and maybe East Germany, and of course, Ukraine.
Great, thanks. So we're gonna have to wrap up fairly soon. I think, see from the questions, I just want to address this because I'm sure it's out there. There has been another area where I guess, I'm not what should I call this, disinformation, I'm not sure what I would call it, but in any case, a bit of an obsession in the media about Azov, and I think, or at least confusion, and that comes up. And I guess maybe who wants to take this? I mean, can someone just explain, sort of put in context, sort of, I mean, the sort of, ideas around sort of the sort of Ukrainian fascists. I mean, I will say right off the bat that the Ukrainian far right, probably does exist, but is, it's been shown to be far weaker than in another context. But can anybody speak to sort of people's concern?
I can briefly comment if you want.
Yeah.
So I'm really unhappy with this word neo-Nazis, because I studied ideologies. I even wrote a book about it. And we should be aware that the concepts of Nazism and fascism presuppose a big state institutions which are occupied by a certain ideology and used as a form of violence. Fascism is just impossible without the idea of state, Italian fascism, and German Nazism is impossible without the idea of state. The problem with Western discourse is that they pointed at far-right groups, nationalist groups, and pointing, well, they're neo-Nazis because they share, you know, on some of their members there is swastika, and they have some very odd and probably unpleasant views, which we don't share, of course, and which we criticize. But the question is about deeds. So Azov was stationed in Mariupol for 8 years at least. Do we have any signs of cleansing? Do we have any signs of mass graves? Do we have any signs of mass killings? Right now, Azov is defending heroically, and this is the word we should use, heroic, and against the new fascism, which produces mass graves, mass killings, and genocide. So this doesn't mean that people like me who are liberals approve of certain views of certain members of Azov battalion or wherever far right, but we should really judge with deeds. The key question is why many people in the West was focusing on marginal nationalist far right groups without without noticing a big neo-fascist state-controlled mechanism, state with 140 million people who were basically developing, including on Western funds for selling gas and oil. That is a big question we should ask.
Okay, I think we'll wrap it up there unless anybody else has a final word.
I'd like to end on a light note.
Yeah.
To go back to your NATO question.
Yeah.
My friend Brian Whitmore, he always likes to put things in a humorous perspective. He told me this joke. He says this Russian cosmonaut comes back to Earth after being away for 6 months and says to his friend, so what's been going on? And his friend says, oh, well, Russia is waging war against NATO. And the cosmonaut says, oh, so how's it going? And his Russian friend says, well, we've lost 22,000 men and so many troops and our flagship battleship and so many generals. And he says, and so what are NATO's losses? And he says, oh, NATO hasn't showed up yet.
Okay, that's a very good way to end. Yeah, thank you, Marta. Okay, thank you very much. Again, I just wanted to sort of, before I let all of you go, we have Ivan Gomza, who is a very smart professor and observer of Ukrainian politics. He's now he used to be at Kyiv Mohyla, he's now at the Kiev School of Economics. He will be speaking on May 5th on basically, which I think is a topic that is quite relevant, is kind of misperceptions and miscalculations of great powers, which I think is sort of quite apropos the Russian invasion and Putin's behavior. So that will start at 10 a.m. on May 5th, and I really hope all of you can come and see that. Okay, thank you very much, and thank you again to Yevhen, Volodymyr, Shelby, and Marta, and hopefully we'll see you again.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.